Thank you all for coming. And I also like to thank the Hannah Arendt Center, Roger Berkowitz, Jana Schmidt, Christine Gonzalez-Stanton for putting together this conference. My name is Lucas Pinheiro, and I'm Assistant Professor of Politics here at Bard. And I'm filling in for Thomas Chatterton-Williams, who couldn't be here today, but he'll be at the conference tomorrow. I'm actually delighted by this turn of events because it allows me to have the opportunity to have this conversation with our speaker for the session, Myisha Cherry, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and works at the intersection of moral psychology and social and political philosophy, in particular on the role emotions and attitudes play in public life. The topic of our conversation today is her fascinating new book, The Case for Rage: Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle, published by Oxford University Press last year, and which I highly recommend everyone to buy and read and cite and teach. It's a great book. So Myisha and I will begin the conversation before opening up to a Q&A with the audience for the remainder 25 minutes of the session. So Myisha, thank you for being here and for giving us all the opportunity to learn from and engage with your work. I want to begin by saying a few words about what I found to be some of the central takeaways from The Case for Rage, and follow up with a few questions to get our conversation started. So among the book's many interpretive and critical achievements, I want to highlight the way in which its careful rehabilitation of rage as a tool for racial justice also serves to revive and foreground anti-racist rage as an important, yet at times neglected dimension of the Black radical tradition, from critiques and acts of resistance against racial slavery and Jim Crow to the ongoing struggles against racism today. Contrary to most dominant renderings of anger as negative, destructive, and vengeful, the book convincingly unveils the transformative, productive, and positive actions that can arise from the feeling of being enraged by racism. As you argue throughout the book, the articulation of rage you endorse here is a specific subset of anger, one that differs fundamentally from negative strains of anger such as ressentiment, rogue, wipe, and narcissistic rage. This is instead an anti-racist form of rage that, drawing on the work of Audre Lorde, you dub Lordian rage. Lordian rage, as I understand it from your account, is distinct from other expressions of anger insofar as it is a response to racism whose aim is not only to confront racial injustice, but to create a racially just world. In this sense, we might read it as a project that strives for the positive transcendence of racial justice, to borrow from Marx. Importantly, Lordian rage is informed by a collective rather than atomized perspective of freedom, in which no one is free until we all are free. Additionally, Lordian rage also provides the necessary fuel for this form of positive and constructive anti-racist action by inciting the necessary eagerness to confront one's object of rage and achieve one's goal, as well as the requisite self-belief and optimism that this goal is attainable, even in the face of seemingly unsurmountable adversity and risk. In 163 pages, the book convincingly dispels and corrects some of the most widely accepted misinterpretations of rage while fine-tuning and developing those that get closer to the Lordian mark, from Aristotle and Joseph Butler to W.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, and curiously, the character Debbie Downer from a recurring Saturday Night Live skit of the early 2000s. As a result, we are left with a useful and transformative political tool for confronting racial injustice. That is, Lordian rage is not only inclusive, action-oriented, and aimed at radical change, it is also compatible with feelings and practices that are routinely seen as the polar opposites of rage, including care, compassion, empathy, and love. In all this, the book's case for the efficacy of rage in anti-racist struggle is as compelling as it is timely. So my first question is about the place of destruction in the productive and positive goals of Lordian rage, if there is one. One could say that even in a constructive project such as the one you outline here, perhaps some form of destruction is not only desirable, but necessary. That is, dismantling white supremacy and abolishing racial hierarchies, as well as the discourses, rules, ideologies, practices, and institutions that sustain racism should be part of the goal to create a racially just world, even if that destruction takes the form of replacing racist institutions with just ones or recreating them from scratch so they might yield more just outcomes. At the same time, such acts of destruction may at first seem to be in conflict with the positive outcomes to which Lordian rage aspires. So if Lordian rage is a means to the broader end of racial justice, what might be the role of destruction, if any, in this positive project? I ask this because I'm particularly convinced by your argument in Chapter 3 that the goal of Lordian rage is neither to make rage look nice or feel good, nor is it to persuade the powerful accomplices of racism to abide by anti-racist demands. This makes me wonder whether the abolition of racist institutions, such as the prison industrial complex, for instance, might be compatible with the positive goals of Lordian rage in a way that, as you put it in Chapter 6, is not the case for the LA riots of '92 and the Baltimore uprising of 2015. In short, can Lordian rage accommodate forms of destruction that incite or lead to its anti-racist goals? Or is destruction itself an inherent symptom of misdirected anger, of nihilism, of Lordian rage gone rogue and in need of anger management? I have other questions, but now I will join Myisha over there and we'll continue this there.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Thank you so much, Lucas. And I'm glad you left it at that, because I was thinking, does he know how old I am? It's no way in the world that I can retain both of those questions and then answer them. So thanks for the question. Also, your first question, immediately gets me in trouble. But I think it's important to kind of talk about this. So the question being that, is kind of destruction baked into the constructive rage that I talk about, or is it the antithesis? And let's go to Audre Lorde for that. So one of the things that she talks about is that the anger at racism that she motivates in her famous essay, The Uses of Anger. She talks about that it's directed towards change. And immediately when she defines that word, I guess with the assumption that people would think that change is like this thing that naturally happens and everybody's happy, she immediately says that change should be defined as a radical alteration of our world. Right? Not a neat one, not a cute one, but a radical alteration of our world. And so when I think about an alteration being radical in the sense that Audre Lorde talked about, that's destruction, right? That's the kind of destruction. And it's interesting when we think about the Black radical tradition and we think about kind of the work of Martin Luther King, which seems to be kind of like the exemplar of how revolutionary justice should go. I mean, he engaged in a radical alteration of our world. And the methods and the movements that he engaged in, and which he was accused of during his time, was destroying Jim Crow, right? So I think that if you are invested in making a racist world into an anti-racist one, and for the emphasis of our discussion today, we're talking about anger. Construction is a cute way to say it, right? Because we are building something up. But as we know, if you're into construction, I just bought a new home that was newly constructed. That is not a flex. But in order for that to occur, something had to be destroyed first, right? That's a prerequisite to the construction process. And so there's no doubt that I do argue that anger is constructive, that it can be constructive to certain kinds of aims, certain kinds of goals. But those goals within themselves has the presumption that a destruction is occurring as a result. So I don't see it as an antithesis, as incompatible. It's baked into that. It's baked into that.
I guess a follow-up to this would be the question of violence, right?
You're gonna get me in trouble.
No, I mean, like these are the
yes.
The topics that the book invites further reflection, and especially because there are the critical tools in the book to make interpretive inroads into acts of violence perhaps that are routinely figured in a certain way as race riots and so on. Like there is in political theory at least, like a surge of rehabilitations, reinterpretations of violence as a virtuous, redemptive, and democratic ideal rather than something that is counterproductive, and so on. And here I wonder this because is there, could we find in Lordian rage, and I say that you're very careful and rigorous to cordon off especially in your reading of King in chapter 4, right? And so I'm glad you bring this up. But is there, right, like a possibility? Would you be willing to allow, and in under what circumstances, violence that would be that would conform and advance the aims and goals of Lordian rage as a tool for anti-racist struggle? And one thing to add is like what you say what you call the racial rules, right? I'm thinking about that as well, right? Because there is in the idea of violence, in this case, the position of illegality, and not only breaking racial rules, but also breaking racial laws as well.
Right, this is good, this is good. So one of the things that I was concerned of when writing the book, and this is one of the things that I'm always concerned of when I'm giving a talk about anger, is that people immediately want to ask the violent question. And I understand that. A lot of the accusations against anger, a lot of the criticisms about anger, and the reason why people think that it doesn't have a place in politics and political life is because of kind of this destructive, counterproductive to liberal aims and deliberation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so immediately they discount it. It's retributive. It aims for humiliation, right? So all of that baggage comes with it. And so what I wanted to do, I guess the spirit of my argument and what is the spirit of the book, is I want to disentangle. I really want to take your mind, and hopefully by the end of the book, you're not making violence synonymous with anger, right? That's one of the goals of the book, one of the things that I want to do. Now, the drawback of that is that I don't talk about violence as much, because what I'm trying to get you all to do is not to think that they are always the same, right? And I can make claims and suggest that fear is also entangled with violence in ways in which we don't talk about, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to disentangle that. So that's one of the reasons why I don't make explicit arguments in that particular regard. But your note in the introduction, one of the things that I do say is, although I don't focus on violence and rage, it's not to say that I don't think that they could be compatible. And so I'm very much influenced by the theorist Candace Delmas, who came out with a book a couple of years ago on civil disobedience, or uncivil disobedience, in which she defends and justifies violence in very different ways to kind of bring about aims of justice. And I'm persuaded there are certain instances and certain contexts in which violence is an apt response to injustice. And if one is angry in that particular context, one might say that them hooking up together to bring about those aims are indeed justified. But it's contextual. It's contextual. There's no doubt that I think the Haitian Revolution, anger and violence, definitely compatible. And we can think about a lot of historical moments and even present-day moments in which it will indeed be justified. It will be in line with the Lordian rage that I'm particularly talking about. But in some ways, I want to say that's the easy argument to make. The difficult thing is to get your minds to automatically disentangle the two. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think that's important if I'm going to make a case for it, to do just that. But it's not to say that there may come a particular context in which anger hooks up with violence to bring about particular aims, and that would be justified. And of course, there's a lot of stereotypes embedded in that I'm trying to disentangle as well. Particularly, we're talking about anti-racist struggle, and we're talking about black folk, and we already have these stereotypes of black folks being the criminal, being beasts, who can't do anything rational, whose aims are always unproductive. I'm also trying to disentangle our minds from those stereotypes as well.
And I'll add that in my view, you succeed at disentangling that, and that's part of why the perspective from which I'm asking is more of, the one that you're talking about, Haiti, but also Maroons in the Americas and so forth.
Okay, and then here's a contemporary. I mean, you mentioned the racial rules. And so for those who have no idea what we're talking about, one of the case that I make in regard to this anti-racist anger is not only is it kind of productive and they ascribe value to lives, but I also say that it break racial rules in society. And if you want more details about that, you can pick up the book. But one of those racial rules is that thou shalt not have a right to white male anger. Right, so if you're a racialized body, you can't be angry. You can express that anger. If you are a white man, the Kavanaughs of the world, you can indeed express anger. We expect for you to express anger. And the reason why we think that you can express anger, because there's a connection between value, respect, and anger, right? So if you think that you're valuable, that you would think that you have claims to respect. And if you're ever disrespected, we would think that you're justified in being angry. But if we live in a society in which you do not have value, then we would think that when you are even being disrespected, you have no claims to respect, and we will be confused when you get angry. So there's an encounter that I mentioned in the book with Officer Darren Wilson. He's describing his encounter with Mike Brown, right? Unarmed Mike Brown. And he basically says, he's describing the moment in which he's shooting Mike Brown. He's describing Michael Brown's reaction. And he says, he looked up at me as if he was possessed, as if he was a demon. And then he says, as if it was making him mad that I was shooting him, right? Those are his exact words, right? So you have in this moment where this individual, this racialized body, is indeed being angry. One might even say that if you're being shot at, you're trying to get to the man who's shooting you so that you can stop. So one might say that that's a response, as a kind of violent activity. But in that moment, he has no right. He has no right to that, right? Darren Wilson has the right to defend himself. To ascribe value, to be angry in that particular moment. But there's confusion about Michael Brown's life. And so what I'm suggesting there is that not only, and I don't think I explicitly say this in the book, that not only is Michael Brown resisting racial rules, right? He's simply saying that, yes, I may be poor, I may be black, but I'm not happy that I'm being shot at, right? So his expression of anger in that moment is to say that I am worthy in this particular moment. But one might even say going towards the officer and trying to defend his life in that particular moment is compatible with the Lordian rage that I'm talking about, and which people still to this day remain confused about.
So one question that I'll end on and open it up to the Q&A is more related to the redemptive sort of reparative dimensions of Lordian rage, or at least what I interpret as something of that kind, right? One of the things that I found so fruitful about your argument is that Lordian rage carries this reparative dimension that seems to be independent of whether its goals are achieved at a mass scale or at an institutional level, right? It's, what I'm trying to get at is like the work that Lordian rage performs on individuals, right, who experience it, seems to be very productively not contingent on standard metrics of success, but on the process of resisting racial domination as a kind of quotidian practice and orientation as well, right? And in this way, Lordian rage is, as you say, inclusive and accessible, right? It's not the Aristotelian sort of version of, it's of a noble sort of rage or anger. And I think that it's as much about sort of like breaking the cognitive, affective, and behavioral aspects of racial rules and doctrines as it is about resisting its institutional policies and legal frameworks, as you put it on chapter 4. And because I think this is, a transformative and very unique feature that you bring out of Lordian rage, I want to ask you whether you see this as a necessary precondition for collective action in the form of mass protests and modes of organizing that target racial injustice at a structural and institutional level. Are the goals of Lordian rage attainable at either one of these levels on their own, or not at all? They are only a result of resistance happening in both of these spheres, collective and individual.
Yeah, so One of the things that I'm convinced of, and I didn't make this argument, but just the tradition itself, is the notion that when it comes to liberation, when it comes to struggle, that you're not only trying to get your claims to rights. The way that oppression works, it's also one is trying to reclaim one's mind, one's soul, one's psychology. And so if that's the case, then when I think about resistance, I don't merely look at resistance as trying to get certain kind of politicians to create policies and to create laws. And if freedom was all that is, then we will be in chains in more ways than one, right? So I think that freedom is more than that, right? I think that even if one is still in chains, and we have our ancestors to attest to this, then one can still be free in their mind because they have not accepted their position, right, and have not accepted their state. And so when I'm thinking about kind of why anger is essential to anti-racist struggle, it's easy to think that anger is only useful when we have these political moments like a Black Lives Matter, when the news is paying attention on you, when you're going to the protests. And I want to say it does indeed have its uses in that particular regard. But when there's no longer any TV screens and people think that, anti-racist action is not taking place because there's no police violence happening on a screen, I want to say that resistance is still occurring and loading and rage is still present. And so in making my argument, I basically says, yes, loading and rage is productive to us to achieve these political aims. But there's another kind of work in very different spheres that loading and rage is doing, right? And that's why in the chapter 2, in which I'm really making my first argument, is I basically says that one of the things that loading and rage does, it ascribes values to lives, right? It basically says that your life matters, that the person who's being oppressed, the person who's being demonized, the person who's a recipient or a victim to injustice, the larger society may not think that their life matter, but me in response, an effective response to their oppression is anger, and that's simply saying that their life matters. Right? This doesn't require that any politician hears or sees that anger from me to make that proclamation over that person's life or whoever I'm in solidarity with, right? So I wanted to make room for when the oppressor and when politicians are not in the room. What is anger doing in that particular space, right? Particular space, right? Affirmation looks like. And I want to say that, yes, loading and rage is doing something on the front lines, but it's also doing something when no one's around, right? And I really mean that literally, when no one is around, right? And so when I talk about breaking racial rules, that even if I'm at work and my boss do something racist, and I got to think about, do I want this check next week? Okay, I'm not going to go off. I don't want to get fired, but I'm responding. I'm having an affective response in which I'm reminding myself, he doesn't think I matter. Right? But I matter. In that moment, I'm saying that resistance is happening. So I'm making space for not only the political or stereotypical notions or popular notions of the political, but also the personal, also the psychological, also the private, that resistance is happening, the affirmation is happening in those contexts in which anger is very much playing a major role. And so to answer your question more directly, loading and rage has a place. Its uses are being manifested in very different spaces. And I want us to be very, very, very aware of that. And so that's why I make the claim later on in that chapter, is that so that we can know that there are resistance figures among us, right? You don't have to be a charismatic leader. You don't have to lead a protest. You don't even have to go to the protest. But simply you responding with anger to the oppression, to the injustice of yourself or to other people. And that's a beginning that one is engaging in resistance in that very moment.
Great. I think that this also jives with the idea that you propose of the necessity of diversity of tactics, right, and strategies. And you are very forthcoming about the fact that this is not the only strategy. And
that is, the anger strategy is not the only strategy.
Right. Yeah. And so this helps to sort of like clarify in a tactical, personal level what you mean. And I'll open it up to the audience.
I mean, I would say, as we're prepping to get that question taken care of, when I say that it's not the only strategy, I do want to say, and we can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A, is that when I say that, one might say, well, why did you even make a case for it? I mean, one of the things I want to say is not the only strategy, and when it is on the scene, it still is not the only strategy. And simply what I mean by that is that anger is never operating alone, right? If you are an ally, it's connected with love in some sense, right? You showing up for people, you being angry at someone's injustice. That's not just anger. That's love. That's compassion. And so when I say it's not the only strategy, I mean, I'm saying that it's joining up with a lot of positive emotions that we have a tendency to say that anger is the antithesis of, yeah.
You talk about how anger can be destructive, and you just mentioned how anger can also mean love. So you're really comparing anger with something else, where it can result in something else. However, what is your exact definition for anger? Because you tend to relate anger to something else, like to explain it. It's like if you think of anger in a certain situation, destructive, love. I think you could even say it's compassionate. But what do you think specifically in this instance? How would you define anger as itself?
Yeah. So anger is an emotion that we feel in response to injustice, in response to moral wrongdoing. When we are angry, it involves a judgment that something is not right with the world and something needs to change. Now, in the book, we have a tendency to stop, one of the things that I suggest is that we have a tendency to stop the definition there. And one of the things I want to say is that there are varieties of anger that exists under political injustice. And we can understand the varieties and get a more deeper insight into the definitions of these varieties. We break them down and we ask several questions, right? So in addition to the definition that I just gave, we should ask, what is the anger directed at? Is it directed at racism, racist policies, or is it directed at scapegoats? Right? Another thing that we can ask is, what is it targeted at? What is it aiming to do? Right? Is it aiming to eliminate someone who makes us uncomfortable? Or is it aimed at destroying unjust structures? Right? Another thing that we can ask is, what is the perspective that influences that particular anger? Is it a zero-sum game of thinking in which we think that if you win, I lose, so you must lose so that I can win? Or is it an inclusive perspective like Audre Lorde had that simply suggested, I am not free until we all are free. So I'm not just trying to get justice just for us, but I'm trying to get justice for all political citizens, right? And depending on how we answer those questions, then I simply argue and suggest, then we can try to figure out if it's the productive kind, the kind that's compatible with liberal goals, or if it is the unproductive kind, the kind that is incompatible with liberal goals. And I want to say that there are a variety of kinds that's unproductive, and as you describe them, and the kind that I'm trying to motivate is the Lordian kind.
Sorry. One thing that I really agree with you about is the fact that anger is essential to creating change because it is one of the most inspiring emotions when you want something done. But a lot of people criticize anger in saying that it's really alienating, which I do think is true, that if you hear somebody angry about something, it can be alienating for people, not necessarily on the other side, but on the fence who aren't as sure. And so I would ask you, how do you suggest we take anger that we have to create change, but sort of channel that to not just be angry, but to also bring other people in and to loop them in with us and to not alienate them?
Right, great question. So let's go back to Audre Lorde. So in her Uses of Anger essay, she talks about an encounter that she has with a white woman, a white feminist that she's in solidarity with. And this is right after Audre Lorde has just given a speech. And so the white lady comes talk to her and says, you know what, I really enjoyed your talk. She says, tell me how you feel, but don't say it so loudly. Right? And Audre Lorde's kind of meditative response is, she says, is it what I have to say that's the problem? Or is it that as a result of what I have to say, you will have to change your life, right? So the resistance, the undefensedness, the discomfort is really rooted on what that anger is calling one to do and not necessarily the anger itself. So in response to your question, which I think is a popular question, and this is one of the ones that I seek to answer in the book, is, as opposed to putting the onus on the angry person to make people comfortable in the room to hear their claims, I'm more interested in the person who's uncomfortable, right? What is the root of your discomfort? So here's the thing. People are usually concerned and says, hey, if I'm angry, then people won't hear me. And I want to say that's not necessarily the case. A lot of people heard Kavanaugh. A lot of people hear angry people, right? And so that's just, I mentioned an example of white people. One of the things, but political theory with persuasion. Frederick Douglass, one of the best orators that we ever had on planet Earth. And when people attest to why his arguments, and I'm talking about his actual speeches, were so convincing and so captivating, you know what emotion they say that made him persuasive? I mean, we're here at a conference on rage, so, right? So the whole thinking that we shouldn't use, rage and persuasion because it's going to make people feel uncomfortable and they're not going to be able to go to your aims, is not necessarily the case. And so I want the person who's uncomfortable to interrogate their lives and try to figure out what is it about the message that is making them uncomfortable. So as opposed to us changing our strategy, I suppose that there's some emotional, some psychological things that needs to transform within that person in order to get them to receive the message, right? I'll stop there.
My question is, would you ever feel that violence should or would be required to make change if peace fails?
See, y'all not getting me in trouble. What's your question again? How much time we got now?
I said, would you ever feel as though violence should or would be required to make change if peace fails?
If peace fails. It's contextual. It's contextual. You got to tell me, I'm not asking you to do this, but say more, right? With any kind of strategy, it calls forth us, looking at what is the state of affairs, right? Because here's also the thing, maybe people think that violence is just something that you just do because peace has failed. And I want to say, we think about kind of liberatory struggles, things are a little bit more reasonable than that. Right, more deliberative than that, and we gotta have a meeting or two to decide if that's the outcome. And if we conclude, given the facts of the case, that it is indeed the case, then perhaps you have to say more. Right? I think one of the things that I can say, and one of the things that I think Lucas and I kind of agree on, is that not all instances of violence is irrational response. And not all instances of anger is an irrational response to an injustice in the world. That's one of the things that I'm very clear on and that I'm committed to. But just when it comes to anger and trying to figure out if anger is apt or not, gotta say more. Give me the facts. And it's the same thing with violence.
I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but just for some clarity. So do you think that when people resist their emotion of anger and explode and start spreading negativity, do you think that it's kind of justifiable, or it's a case of good rage or good anger?
Yeah, so that's good, right? So I kind of in the book, after I made a case for rage, I end the book talking about anger management, right? Because that's important here, right? I mean, one of the things that I strongly believe when it comes to emotions, it's not as if, as much as I'm making a case for rage, I'm really making a case for the outraged, right? That emotions are not these abstract entities to take care over our bodies and we have no agency whatsoever, right? And so one of the things I want to say is that, hey, if it requires us, right, in order to make things happen in the world coupled with anger, then let's talk to us to make sure that even if we have this anger, what do we have to do to make sure that it remains productive, that it remains motivational, that it remains apt? And so I offer suggestions to white allies, and I offer suggestions for just people of color in general, of some steps to take to make sure that their anger stays resistant and stays Lordian, all right? And so one of the suggestions that I give is that it's important for us to be around people that can keep us accountable, that knows about our particular commitments and our particular aims, that can hold us accountable when we're doing things, saying things, doing things with our anger that doesn't align with that, right? And I call those people moral critics, right? And so the instances that you're referring to, if it's the case that I'm angry, and that anger becomes incompatible with my own aims and my commitments and the way in which I want to, comport myself in the world, then I need to make sure I have people that's going to hold me accountable to say, hey, you're getting out of hand, right? And so in cases like that, you want to make sure that you have the moral critic to keep you accountable. In cases like that, you want to remind your own self, if that happened to be the case, that it's incompatible with what you want to do. So I want to say that it can be managed, that when it becomes unproductive, and I offer suggestions to make sure that it doesn't get there, but when it gets there, we can hold it or rein it back in with these techniques that I think it's important for us to take on.
Hi, can I ask mine first? Sorry. Yes, so you spoke a little bit about that inner work and the liberation of the mind with that Lordian rage. But do you believe it is truly possible when navigating double consciousness, code switching? You mentioned the workplace. I know that's something as me, as a woman of color, a Black woman, that constantly struggles with. Like, if I still feel liberated in the mind, if I'm doing this Lordian approach, right? But my outward, my setting doesn't match that. So does it always have to follow up with like real change in the world or in my atmosphere, right? For me to truly feel liberated in the mind.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, if you ever think that you're fully liberated is an interesting question. Listen, I mean, when it comes to kind of the work in responding to white supremacy in a sexist world, and thinking about the things that are required for the oppressed and what they need to do to kind of keep their sanity and continue to survive and thrive. One of the things that Audre Lorde talks about in her essay, Eye to Eye, for example, when she's speaking directly to Black women, and she talks about what happens when you internalize this hatred. And not only when you internalize the hatred, that misogyny kind of directs your way, but how does that affect your relationships with other Black women? And how do you now you got this extra thing that you got to deal with to make sure that you don't kind of displace the cruelty that you feel directed at you as a Black person, putting that on another Black woman. And one of the things that she offered up suggestions in that essay of what Black women can do particularly. And she ends by saying, I'm not saying that the process will not be long or difficult, but it's possible. And my response to you is that, hey, I mean, we're battling in so many fronts, right? So you got the political front, you got the work front, the economic front, you got the relational front, then you got the psychological front. Right? It's a lot. The struggle is real, right? And to ever feel that you're free in any one of those fronts, I mean, we probably don't even know that, right? And even thinking that we can be fully free in those fronts can be difficult, right, to even think that. But still, I'm convinced by Audre Lorde, the process is difficult and it's long. But I think freedom is possible. And I think consistent with just the Black radical tradition is journeying towards freedom, right? Waking up every morning, declaring and deciding to be free is a first important step to the full freedom. So even if you don't fully feel free, what am I doing? You ask yourself, what did I do today to get more freer? How did I live my life to be, so that it can be more loving and more freeing today? And I think that process itself is worth it, even if we never think that we've actually got there. I think freedom, I mean, this is Angela Davis here, freedom is a constant struggle. But are you struggling? That's the question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That wonderful double presentation. I experienced very bad road rage yesterday, and I was on the Taconic, and I was probably doing something wrong as usual, either not paying attention or going too fast, and this big car behind me just went crazy, came this close, honking. And when it passed me, I looked at the driver, and this was a big white guy, and I immediately thought, oh, Trumpian. But what I did by doing that, first of all, that man communicated me his rage. I actually felt rage because of his rage, and I thought to myself, what if I were the big white guy and someone, a black guy is driving the car, or I'm an anti-Semite, and the person, me, I'm the person with the yarmulke, whatever. The prejudices that we can feel towards somebody in a situation that is so innocuous. We don't know, I do not know this person doesn't know me, but there was a hatred when we passed each other, and I felt it, and I then kept thinking the irrational nature of rage, the irrational nature of prejudice, something that is so embedded, that is so not personal. And as much as I believe in everything you say and everything Audre Lorde says, I felt the rage and I felt the ressentiment that you, Lucas, was talking about earlier. I'm not asking for an answer, but it was so...
Oh, you're going to get one, though. No, just like...
It was so demoralizing, It was so demoralizing because when I teach, I talk about Levinas and I talk about the looking at the other person. We looked at each other and there was no love there. So I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was my fault because I do wrong things on the Taconic, but still.
Yeah. No, this is good. So you might think, as in talking about Audre Lorde, and she writes an essay, The Uses of Anger, and now I wrote this book and I'm making a case for rage, and the assumption is that all cases, all instances are good. It's all good. Let's make a case for it. But when you look at the work, I just mentioned her essay, Eye to Eye. And that's one of the essays that's not typically mentioned, particularly her audience is primarily black women, and so people think that it's an inside conversation happening, so I'm not going to touch it. But in that essay, it's a different Audre Lorde from The Uses of Anger, right? She's criticizing anger in that essay. So you must ask, she writes it 2 years after The Uses of Anger. Did she change her mind, right? Does she think that anger is no longer useful, right? No, she basically suggests that anger becomes problematic when it's coupled with hatred. And so the essay itself is really a deep dive into hatred and how hatred leads to self-hatred and how that self-hatred can produce a cruelty and an anger in the world, right? So she offers suggestions not on how to get rid of the anger that's tied to hatred, but how to get rid of the internalized hatred. And she thinks that would have the ripple effect of getting rid of the cruelty and the anger, right? The only time that James Baldwin critiques anger in his work is when he says that it connects with hatred. And that hatred, that comparing or that coupling with hatred, with anger, turns into bitterness, in which he believes and he predicts will be what he calls the fire next time. And so I want to suggest that your encounter, and you said this with your own words, your encounter with that individual, you said you felt the anger. I want to say that you felt the anger plus the cruelty plus the hatred, right? And when you've entered into that domain, we have the problems that Audre Lorde, that James Baldwin, that Martin Luther King was very much concerned about, right? And that is the kind of stuff that we want to interrogate, right? But it's not just the anger. And so I love the fact that you said, the absence of love. Yes, that's something we need to criticize. The hatred, yes, that's something that we need to criticize. But it wasn't the anger simpliciter. It was some other stuff, and you hinted at that. It was some other stuff embedded in that. And it's that other stuff that we need to criticize in order to sanitize and get that good anger back that would not happen as a result of a road incident, but would happen to something that's a little bit more morally apt.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this is working. We are in a great college here, and the thing that made me also very sad is that I have a bumper sticker that says, what would Don Quixote do? And the fact that that bumper sticker, he was so close to it, he could read it. And that made me feel, oh my God, have we failed? Has our literary education failed? Don Quixote would never have done that. So, sorry, but thank you.
I just want to follow up on the question about violence here. I'm not going to let you off
I saw it in your
I'm not
face.
going to let you
I
off
saw
the
it in your
hook like
face.
that. No, so here's the thing. Contextual, yes. Circumstances, yes. But can we think? And I'm asking.
And we need
you
to
as
be
the
very clear about what we
philosopher.
mean by violence too. So
Right, exactly. And in FISEM, the first year seminar here, we're reading Gandhi, Hind Swaraj, and there is a justification for nonviolent passive resistance, a justification that is about principles, right? That is about the means and the ends being connected, like a seed is to a tree. And the idea is if you and this, then you can add like contextualization to, but at least like having some starting off, principles. And if you gain certain rights through a certain mode of resistance, the society that will develop out of those means, will be significantly affected. And for him, it's a matter of not, this lack of congruence between rights and duties, and replacing that with brute force. And instead of a duty, citizens feel a sort of fear of a threat of being punished. Right, and so like, can maybe we articulate a position about violence that proceeds from certain principles that we can then apply to real case scenarios?
that's going to require a lot of work. That's a paper, Lucas, that we should co-author together. But yeah, I'm thinking about King here, which is very much inspired by Gandhi. And King, his ethic that kind of undergirded the movement was what he called a love ethic, right? He was very consistent and found theological justifications and philosophical justifications for a love ethic. And so if the ethic is one of love, then of course the political strategy is going to be a strategy of nonviolence. I mean, it just aligns with the love ethic. And that makes sense for what he wanted to do. And this is very much aligning with principles, et cetera, et cetera. And, but I think we're deceiving ourselves to think that as a result of that King never felt anger or never made use of it, right? So when we think about the life of King, when we think about kind of the letter from a Birmingham jail, for example, one of the wonderful pieces of political philosophy, that was written out of anger, right? His lawyer comes to him, basically sends him a hot-off-the-press letter that some clergymen have written, and I mean, him being mad as hell is an understatement to describe what he was feeling. And so he takes pieces and scraps of paper in his jail cell and writes this wonderful piece out of anger, right? Love ethic, nonviolence, but still anger. When he writes a speech about, in tribute to W. Du Bois, and this is, mind you, this is the late 60s, and so the Black Power movement is happening. You have these young people who are just fed up and tired, and so they are angry, and so he's trying to figure out how to talk to them and talk with them. He doesn't demonize their anger. Not even there, right? He doesn't demonize their anger. He basically says to them, and I'm just paraphrasing here, yeah, your anger is cool, but come on and join our movement so that you can do something constructive with that particular anger, right? So you have someone who understands that there's certain kind of principles, love ethic, and it match, and therefore to be consistent, we got to have a political strategy that's going to match up with that nonviolence. But even that picture itself, and you think about the life and the writings of King, doesn't take away the anger thing that I'm referring to, right? So you have that particular context. But it's to go back to kind of address your worry here. It's not to say what I'm trying to say with the King thing, that even if you have that in place, is not to say that there's still not an important place, important role that anger is not playing, even within those particular movements. And it could be another context in which we live by very different principles that are just principles, and that leads us to very different strategies, right? America with the American Revolution, same thing, right? So we had the strategy to kind of fight back, and the declaration is the principles. Violence, seems to align. And so that's what I mean by context. Let's think about, and King had a very different kind of understanding about his world, the context, the possibilities in that particular context. But still, even in the midst of that, anger was still very much present.
Dr. Cherry, thanks for the conversation with Dr. Pinheiro.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone else as well. It was really scintillating. I have to admit, I haven't read all of your book. I read the first 2 chapters and sitting on my desk, so maybe you answer the question in the latter parts of the book. But I'm interested in whether you think that those other forms of anger that you describe at the start of the book, whether there's a way for them to be transmuted into the Lordian form of anger that you describe. So, here's a case, Korean on black violence in LA, and so interracial violence, which is non-accidental, it's caused by the structure of white supremacy and by capitalism and all the rest of it, pitting people against each other. So there's a sense in which that anger is justified, but it's misdirected.
Right.
How do we redirect that anger?
No, that's good, that's good. So class, if you go back to what I said originally, and I simply said that there are certain questions that we can ask ourselves in which we're able to determine what kind of anger we have and therefore determine if it's productive or unproductive or not. You all remember that? Right? So I talked about aims. What is it? What is the target of the anger? What is one seeking to do with it? What is the perspective that influenced it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of that, we get these kinds that I talk about in the book. We get, for example, rogue rage, not road rage. That's an unproductive kind. We get a kind called wipe rage. We get a kind like narcissistic rage, and then I put those against the Lordian kind, the more productive kind. Now, it's interesting here because one of the things that I suggest is that, like, say, for instance, wipe rage and rogue rage is like the Charlottesville, January 6th kind of ish rage, but not restricted to them, right? And then you see something like the Lordian rage that I'm particularly talking about that's a little bit more positive, and we can imagine examples of that in our minds. But then there's a kind called narcissistic rage. This seems to be much better than the wipe rage and the rogue rage, like January 6th folk, but it's still not Lordian just yet. Right? And the reason why it's not Lordian just yet is that it has a narrow focus, right? It only, so you can imagine, I take this from Bell Hooks in her book, Killing Rage. The example that she gives is you can imagine some elite black folk who is not interested in police brutality whatsoever, right? They basically suggested if you had an encounter with the police, the black elites are just simply going to say you shouldn't have been, he was at the wrong place at the wrong time, you shouldn't have been there. Right? Or you should have pulled your pants up, right? Or you should have wore a suit, right? So basically blame poor black folk for their encounters with the police. But things change as soon as they are driving in their Mercedes-Benz in the wrong neighborhood. They get pulled over by the police and So they're angry at this injustice, right? But they're only angry because they got stopped by the police, right? Not because black folks get stopped by the police, right? So it's not scapegoating. But the focus is quite narrow, right? And given that the focus is quite narrow, then when we think about kind of what they're aiming to do with that particular anger, is that they are expressing their place within a hierarchy. I'm not like a poor black person. How dare you treat me like this, right? And so the perspective that influences it is this kind of this inapt self-importance. Doesn't have to be that way. Right? If that person takes my class or reads my book, then perhaps they will understand that freedom is not just about you getting yours, but it's about all of us being to live in a world in which they're not vulnerable to state violence. And if you really accept that as a perspective to live your life, then when you get pulled over by the police, perhaps your anger would not just be targeted at your encounter, but the fact that this is happening again to people who look just like you. And so you can see that slowly but surely, the features of what could have been or what was narcissistic rage, with a change of perspective, can begin to morph into the Lordian kind that I'm referring to. So there's hope, there's possibilities, right? That given the features that I talk about in the book, that if you change a feature of it, it can slowly but surely lead us to the Lordian kind. Thank you.